Welcome, everyone. I am very excited to see you all today for what promises to be a very exciting panel. My name is Jill Goldenseal, and together with Rob Blitt, I am co-chairing and co-moderating today the Southeast Interest Group of the American Society of International Law. Our panel is titled Winning Likes and Minds, Creative Responses to the International Struggle Over Information. And this is a particularly timely panel. Just yesterday, there was a hearing held by the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology together with the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce of the Committee on Energy and Commerce, that's a mouthful, of the United States Congress on Disinformation Nation, social media's role in promoting extremism and misinformation. And just this morning, the New York Times reported that a second major defamation suit has been filed against Fox News by Dominion, the maker of voting machines, over disinformation in coverage over the 2020 election. So clearly a hot topic that governments all over the world are addressing. And we are very lucky to have a panel of esteemed experts to talk to us about ways to combat that today. We are going to proceed today by hearing from our panelists. First, I'll introduce them, of course, and then we will continue with a Q&A. For audience members, a widget will show up in the chat or on the screen, and you'll be able to place your questions in there. Then, thanks to our virtual format, this year we will have the option to continue the conversation in a separate Zoom room after the panel ends. We will put the link for that in the chat, and everyone who would like to can join us. During the course of the panel, audience members will have the opportunity to chat with each other together to everyone in the Zoom chat and in private to one another if you would like. On to our panelists. First, we will hear from Priscilla Moriucci, who is a non-resident fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard University. Then we'll hear from Dr. Henning Lohmann, who is a senior researcher at the Digital Society Institute at ESMT Berlin. Third, we'll hear from Costanza Scubia Caniglia, who is the special editor for commentaries at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government Misinformation Review. And then finally, Faisal Saeed Al-Muddar, who is the founder and president of Ideas Beyond Borders. With that, I will turn it over to Priscilla.
Thank you, Jill, and everyone for having me. And I'm excited to have this discussion today. So as the first panelist, I wanted to talk a little bit before we kind of get into some details about terminology. So in this space, there are a lot of different words and terms: misinformation, disinformation, information operations, influence operations, information manipulation, and it kind of goes on and on, right? So from my particular perspective, I'm a researcher. I research and look at mostly the tactical elements of information operations, mainly on social media. So when I refer to this sort of large scale misinformation and disinformation, I tend to look at it in an operational sense. And I use the word information operations. And I like to refer to this definition of a term called information manipulation, right, which was coined by some French researchers a few years ago, because it helps frame what exactly I'm looking at when I talk about an influence operation or an influence campaign. So first off, that it's a coordinated campaign across a large number of platforms and tools. Second, that the campaign involves a diffusion of false information or information that's consciously distorted. Right? So this makes it an influence campaign different than propaganda, right? And I think that's an important distinction to make as well. And also third, that there's a political intent to cause harm, right, to either the reader or the target of this particular operation. So in the sense of information and influence operations, it's important to distinguish that propaganda, right, in the sense of RT or Xinhua News, right, is not equivalent. Those organizations are not equivalent to, say, the BBC in the UK or National Public Radio. So when I give these talks a lot, some people ask me questions about like, well, why can't you say, isn't Xinhua just like BBC News, right? And it's distinctly not, right? And the way that we study the tactics that are used by sort of state media, such as RT and Xinhua, right, and the tactics that are used by influence operators very separately from what we would call just sort of state-funded media, right, or media that has funds from the state, like NPR or BBC. So again, it's this coordinated campaign, diffusion of false information, right, that's consciously distorted with the political intent to cause harm. So next, I just wanted to go into and take the next, few minutes to talk from my perspective about, who conducts influence operations, what other goals broadly, right, both short-term and long-term, tactics and techniques that I've observed at the operational level on social media platforms, and ideas and proposals that I have for detecting influence operations while they're sort of ongoing. So first, who conducts influence operations? Everyone. I think we could largely say nation states such as China, Russia, Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina. I mean, the list could go on and on and on, have sponsored influence operations on social media. Private entities are also involved in influence operations, everything from public relations firms, political campaigns, marketers, intelligence companies, but all of this intersection, right? And this convergence, I think we'll talk, at least something that I've noticed a lot, and I will continue to talk about, this convergence of tactics, right? Goals, short-term goals, right? And ideas in this influence operations space. It was not, I think when, at least in the sort of public space and in the media, there's a lot of talk about nations, right, being the only kind of purveyors of influence operations. And from a tactical and a practical perspective, that's not the case, that there is a convergence between nation states, the tactics that are using even some of the short-term and long-term goals, and private entities like public relations firms and political campaigns. This idea that private entities sort of abuse and normalize influence tactics and tradecraft, and make these type of operations less unusual and more normal for social media consumers. Increasingly, also, we see sort of criminals engaging in influence operations as well, what we would call sort of like disinformation or influence as a service. This is increasingly available, not necessarily on the sort of dark right web or criminal marketplaces, but increasingly as sort of a gray service offered on a number of marketplaces and storefronts that are available, just on your regular browser. Largely, actors involved in influence operations have different long-term or different strategic goals, right? Depending on whether they're a nation state or a criminal organization or a private entity. But in a large part, they share the same short-term goals, right? One, engaging in operations to persuade an audience, right, to a specific point of view. Second, to either polarize or divide the intended target. And three, to raise their specific narrative to a national level media or national level conversations. On the long-term and strategic goals, countries, I think we talked a little bit before this started about Russia and China, right? Their tactics and their, we would call them TTPs or operational tactics, are driven by their long-term goals, right? So Russian influence operations tactically look different than Chinese state-sponsored influence operations because they have different longer-term goals, right? So for Russia, it's more about challenging this international system, right? Challenging the unity of NATO, dividing the US and the EU, right? And that requires a different set of tactics for their influence operations than China, who's much more focused on sort of propagating this Chinese dream, gaining more influence in these kind of existing international systems, and maintaining this kind of positive image, right, of the state and the party, and this kind of like the rising tide raises all boats idea. Tactically, there are the use at the operational level a broad range of tactics are in use by both nation states and criminals. And even within these sort of larger actor sets, like Russian, for example, influence operators, you have a wide variety of maturity of technique, everything, and the ability, right, to persuade an audience. So some of the TTPs I'm just going to briefly touch on the tactics, that we can get certainly more into, are one, sort of obscuring the fraudulent origins of their content. Citizen Lab put out this great study a couple years ago where they called this tactic ephemeral disinformation, right? And the Iranian, in this case, it was the Iranians, and they were quite good at obscuring the fraudulent origin, right, by convincing mainstream reporters in the United States to report on, right, the leads of stories that their sort of fake influence accounts had pitched for these reporters. So that's sort of a common technique, is to try to obscure these fraudulent origins. Another one is to essentially initially put your content on self-publishing websites or smaller forums, and then kind of work your way up the forum chain to try to get to the mainstream. There are also quite prevalent among Chinese and Russian operators, for example, are these two types of accounts. One was sort of called content creators, so accounts that are sort of typing their own messages, right, or creating their own content. And then there are amplifier accounts, right, which simply turn up the volume, right, amplify that content. As we see today, there's much less overt fake news, right, than there was in 2015 and 2016, right? And instead, what we see in many cases and across the board is this more use of hyper partisan, sharply polarized narrative, right? Or using certain facts to ground misinformation, right? For example, the idea that Bill Gates helped fund the development of the COVID vaccine, true, right? But taking that fact, right, and building on a conspiracy theory or a misinformation narrative on something like that. Um, extreme, we have both extreme micro targeting, so in which small groups of people based on their interests, right, are targeted with very tailored messages, right? At the same time, the actor sets utilizing broad cross-platform campaigns. So I'm happy to go into a little bit more of the tactics, but as I only have a minute or two left, I wanted to talk a little bit about detection before we moved on. So from my perspective, detecting and countering influence operations as they're occurring can only occur at scale, right? So my optic on this is, I think that large scale metadata analysis using machine learning techniques is really the way that we counter or we identify information operations while they're ongoing, right? So the ways that we would do this using machine learning, right, is to sort of look at the components of fraudulent information operations activity. So one is like posting behavior, right? There are a number of factors: periodicity, right? Percentage of retweet or reposting versus additional content, following versus followers, something like that. Those are one set of factors. The second, what is your profile, or what does this account look like? Are there misaligned usernames and profile names, stolen photos, right? Multiple chains of name and location. Um, that's another factor that we can use kind of machines, right? And even sort of an AI to do. And my last point, I think, before I'll stop, is that from a detecting and like a what do we do and how do we counter this, my perspective, and I'm not an attorney, right, is that there has to be a legal regime to force action on this behavior by the social media platforms, um, because taking down fraudulent content, right, and this engagement works against their business model, right, of user engagement. So I'll stop there. And thanks, everyone.
Yeah, I'm just gonna start right up. Thank you, Priscilla. That was really interesting, and I'm sort of building on saying that more or less. It's really inspiring and fascinating conference. because that's where I'm mostly focused on when I talk about these things. I think part of the reason for how or where the discourse has gone in international law, it's people are saying my connection is bad. Is that true? Anyway, most people who work on disinformation at the moment did before work on cyber operations or cybersecurity, and I think this has led to some presumptions about how disinformation works and how disinformation should be addressed within international legal frameworks that have maybe led to some misconceptions. So what international lawyers have been doing so far is they've been latching onto like familiar notions, familiar concepts such as sovereignty, the principle of non-intervention, even the prohibition of the use of force, maybe, and try to grasp disinformation that amounts to election interference or that amounts to disinformation in health-related issues during a pandemic within this broad framework. And I would argue that it's maybe not the best framework to address it, mostly because of two main structural features of the secondary law on state responsibility. And the first one, and I think Priscilla has already addressed that very well, is the problem of attribution. Of course, we've also talked about attribution a lot concerning cyber operations, but the mechanics, of course, are a little different. Here, it's not always a problem to identify which actor is posting what, or even maybe identify what individual is behind it, but it's very hard often to establish a connection to a state, to really establish was the state controlling this operation? Is this part of a larger campaign, or is this maybe just someone who's privately voicing their views? I think we haven't really figured out how to solve the puzzle of attribution there, even though we have already dealt with it for years now when it comes to cyber operations. To give just one example, like on Twitter, we all know the bon mot, retweets are not endorsements. So what do we do with an actor that we can maybe attribute to a state, that we can say like this is a state actor, but they are mainly just like amplifying narratives that are already out there? Are we then attributing the whole narrative to that state, or is this maybe more complicated? The second issue, and I think this is even a greater issue when it comes to state responsibility, is the problem of causation. If we argue that a certain disinformation campaign, an electoral interference campaign, is, for example, violating the principle of sovereignty, as was maybe the case with the 2016 presidential election in the United States, to even if we can attribute that to an actor like Russia, can we say that what they did, that the campaign that they ran for months and maybe even years, was that really the cause for Trump being elected? This is not a trivial issue. And there again, we really haven't established any clear standards for how we should deal with that issue. Because what we need, of course, for causation, because it's not like there is one piece of disinformation, someone reads it and then immediately decides to vote for Trump, even though otherwise they would have voted for Clinton in that case. This is not really how it works. So it's much more slowly unfolding. We have attitudes changing, not really actions changing so much, and it's within the framework that we have in the law of state responsibility. I think it's very hard to really address that. So this is another thing that I think we need to think about before we really just try to apply our old concepts. Which leads me to a few more points that I wanted to make that are more legal political maybe than strictly doctrinal. The whole focus on notions such as sovereignty, prohibition of intervention, some have even argued that electoral interference via disinformation might be a use of force, might be an act of war. I have actually read that. Is of course that we are turning this whole issue of disinformation into a security issue. And I'm not trying to suggest that it's not a security issue, but I would argue it's mainly a societal issue that has somewhere down the line has security ramifications. And I think this is an important distinction when it comes to the question, how should we deal with this? How should we address this? And of course, when we think about it mainly in security terms, then we have actors, like domestic actors, like in the US, the CIA or Cybercom, or in Europe. We have like our familiar remedies, such as countermeasures. What we saw in the 2018 midterm election, that the US were then launching a cyber operation against the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg to disrupt their ongoing disinformation campaign, which might be one way to deal with it, but I'm not convinced that this is a very effective long-term remedy to deal with the issue of disinformation. Which brings me to the next point. It's not only then a security issue, it also externalizes the whole problem. Of course, it's not wrong to focus on malicious foreign actors who try to disrupt our democratic society, so try to interfere with our democratic decision-making processes in Western societies. But it might ultimately, just to focus on this as one outside threat that we need to act against is, I think, also ultimately misleading, because of course, we tend to then look in the wrong direction, because I think the reason that these actors are so successful right now and eroding trust in our institutions and in disrupting these processes in our countries is because they're able to exploit the persistent problems within our societies. They are able to exploit systems of misogyny, systems of white supremacy, of racism. And this is, of course, what makes these campaigns so successful. So just focusing on this as an outside threat, that's somehow coming over us, I think is also misguided, because it makes us look in the wrong direction and maybe apply the wrong remedies. So the reason they are so successful is, as I said, because of what's going on in our societies. And I think we could really see that around the 2020 presidential election, and both afterwards and before, but especially around like January 6th and what happened at the Capitol. These are domestic problems that we need to deal with before we can then focus on foreign actors. I think this is something that we should keep in mind when we deal with the problem of disinformation. So Thomas Reid of Johns Hopkins University, I think, put it best when he said, these are slowly unfolding attacks against the liberal epistemic order. And I think this is how we should think about this problem. This is not something that we can remedy with one countermeasure, or where we can say like, but this is a violation of our sovereignty. This is a violation of the principle of non-intervention. It's not wrong to focus. I'm not doubting the ODNI report. I'm not doubting that these campaigns exist, that Russia, China, Iran are intervening and trying to interfere with our decision-making processes, but I think we're making it very easy for them to do so at the moment. And I would just think we would maybe be better off if we start focusing on the disinformation that's already happening in our society. If I've pointed a lot of fingers, of course, these fingers are firmly pointed at myself as well. So I've written about these things from this like outside perspective in the terms of sovereignty and non-intervention. But I've come to believe that maybe this is not the most sustainable long-term solution for the problem. Thank you.
Okay, I will go. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Robert, Jill, it's really a pleasure to be here today. And also I'm very, very happy to follow Priscilla and Henning presentation, because I don't know if you could see everybody on the panel, but I was just like shaking my head like that. So I very much agree with what they said. So I will not do a full presentation. I'm just gonna use my time to raise some of the issues that I found in my work in terms of international regulation against disinformation. And also I'm gonna try to make the case, so I will tell you immediately where I wanna go with my speech. So it's hopefully clearer. I want to argue for a multinational, multilateral response to disinformation. I think is the most efficient rather than a national response. However, with some caveats, it should be a multilateral response that also includes civil society organization, academia, and most importantly, not most importantly, sorry, not at all most importantly, digital companies. So the reason why I'm saying this, and the European Union new regulatory package, I think, is a good example of a type of regulation that goes into that direction. However, it's very, very new. It has been just released, so it will take at least 3 years to implement. So we'll see how it will go. But I think there are good signals in that direction. But before I go into this, I would like to set a little bit the problems that I have seen in my work. And the reason why I'm focusing on multinational, multilateral response is because before focusing on disinformation, I was working at the United Nations and especially on the UN Security Council, and I saw really the impact that disinformation had on most vulnerable parts of the population, and especially civilians in conflict in that case. And there I saw also the importance to have a common response. Now, obviously, there are a lot of issues in responding as a bloc, especially because I think the caveat with this multilateral response is that it needs to be based on upholding democratic values. And so, for example, not all international organizations can have can hit this goal. For example, for the United Nations, it has been a problem to try and pass resolution with a language that was agreed upon also from non-democratic states. So what are the issues? From the point of view of, I'm now going to define disinformation again. I think Priscilla did a pretty good general description. But in this case, I want to talk only about disinformation. So false content that is spread with an intent to deceive and mislead. So this content is very harmful, as I was saying, and especially harmful both for democratic institutions and for the most vulnerable parts of the population. However, it's not illegal content. So even for the digital platforms is really difficult to monitor and to take off. They have become pretty efficient taking off illegal content such as terroristic content, in some cases, pornographic content, pedophilia, etc. However, disinformation cannot be considered illegal. It's not illegal, and it could even not be considered as such, because as Henning and Priscilla also were noting, there are problems of attributions, and there are problems also of narratives that pre-exist in some cases disinformation campaigns. So the way disinformation campaigns typically is they might start with a coordinated behavior, inauthentic behavior, but they might also not start like that. They can have components of coordinated behavior, but if they are efficient, if they are successful, typically they insert themselves into information networks that are existing in a certain country. And so then there is organic behavior that intervenes in that same campaign. And so how do you then distinguish what is coordinated behavior and what is organic behavior? Another reason that, sorry, the timing. So coordinated behavior, it's difficult to attribute. One other reasons, and this is also one reason why I don't think that artificial intelligence would be a good solution for disinformation, against disinformation. Another reason is that in digital platforms, as they are designed right now, the user interface mixes different languages in the same interface. And so a multilingual user can and does, in fact, translate campaigns in other languages. So it's very difficult to find attribution, even when the campaigns are spread into communities that might not have been the primary targets of the campaign. So what does that mean, and what can we do instead? So what the European Union has done has been to create different packages and different types of policy. I don't want to say regulation for some of them, which are very much including this democratic component. So it is the European Democracy Action Plan, which is very much connected with the Action Plan against disinformation. And then the Digital Service Act that has been released most recently. Now, the problem with the European Union approach to this is that to include the digital platforms, their participation is voluntary. And this obviously has some weaknesses because the participation of the digital platforms has been positive in some sense, but also with ups and downs. However, I think this comes from a crisis of sovereignty as well between nation states and digital platforms. There is an asymmetrical information between sovereign governments and digital platforms at the moment, where the digital platforms, of course, have grown exponentially in the past couple of years and have been, they have different incentives from nation states. However, the states still have privileges of taxation and regulation over the platform. So there is kind of a sovereignty struggle that is reflected here. Now, maybe in the long term, the states should regain control of infrastructures, of information infrastructures, but as the situation is now, the only solution is to have a voluntary participation, however, with this weaknesses. And so one thing that I wanted to say is there has been some scholar work that has tried to consider disinformation as an act of war. And in some cases, some states have also taken action, or not really action, but for example, the United States had the Trump administration had issued an executive order with sanctions in case of information operation. They haven't really used it, but they could have. And some have taken from this the fact that because in the 2020 US elections, we actually did see much less foreign interference compared to the 2016 elections as a deterrence. However, I don't really think that we can demonstrate this. Foreign interference has gone down comparatively, but domestic interference has gone up a lot. And so we don't really know whether foreign actors thought that their strategic interests were already met somehow or not. So I think I will conclude here and just say, oh, it's okay. So I will just close here with saying that I think multilateral response to disinformation is the most efficient. And hopefully, I would like to see more of that in the future.
I guess it's my turn. Hello, everyone. This is Faisal Matar, and from Ideas Beyond Borders. And I would like to kind of bring a personal story here. My first interaction with misinformation was actually in the year 2005. And I was watching a documentary from National Geographic that showed that Iraq invaded Kuwait. And at the time, I was amazingly mind blown because that is exactly not I was taught by the state government, which is the regime of Saddam Hussein. And the narrative was that we were invaded by 33 countries led by Israel, and we actually won that war. And that message was reinforced in religious institutions, educational institutions, the media, which we used to have only two state-run media that was controlled first by the Ministry of Intelligence and the son of Saddam Hussein, which is Uday Saddam Hussein. And that's actually where I realized that that misinformation is a big issue where I grew up. And Iraq is a kind of a very unique situation because of the war in 2003, in which we transitioned from two state-controlled television stations into 1,000 newspapers and TV stations after the kind of the removal of Saddam Hussein led to the chaos of information sources. And that's where some of the countries mentioned, Iran played actually a major role in being that kind of alternative source of information to Iraqis in post-war in 2003. So I always compare it as like we moved from like 1984 to Brave New World within the span of a year, and you don't really know. We reached from the state decides what the truth is to actually no one knows what the truth is, to the way that Iraq became more and more balkanized, in which every province and every city within a province can receive a very different set of information from the other province and the other people, to the way that there's no basic agreements on what the facts are. And to give you kind of another kind of context, which is now brings me kind of where IBB fits in. So if you were born in 1960 in Iraq, you have actually lived 6 years in a row, starting first with the Iraq-Iran war in 1980, moving forward to the last war with the war with ISIS. And through all that period from 1960 to today, you have actually the sources of information kept changing as you live. And as a result of that ecosystem, there has been a backfiring in which there was an ultimate lack of trust in any sort of public institutions, including international institution agencies like the UN, etc., because that created a huge backfire in which people reached a moment is that they don't know who to trust anymore. And with every institution, there is always that story about corruption and the story about stealing people, stealing money. And that really affected the public health messaging during the COVID pandemic about how, and the Iraqi Ministry of Health was constantly pushing the line of what wear a mask and all of that stuff. But at the same time, the narrative has already been said that this is a corrupt minister running a corrupt institution, and which in any way, any belief between a relationship between government institution and the public is actually pretty much eroded. So this is what I work. And that's as a result of understanding that ecosystem that I grew up in, I founded this organization called Ideas Beyond Borders. And our main program and the main issue that we try to solve, I mean, there are a lot of issues that exist in the region, but there's one that is within the control of kind of a small NGO like ours, is really changing the information landscape in Arabic and the language spoken in Iraq and around the region. So we started this program called the House of Wisdom 2.0, which is named after the center of translation in Baghdad in the 13th century, in which most people in Iraq and also the region look at it from a positive light. So we started the kind of the digital phase of the House of Wisdom, and we call it the House of Wisdom 2.0. And that really kind of reviving that era within the MENA region and also Iraq, in which Iraq was forward-looking, used to take information from other parts of the world, and used to kind of apply tools of critical thinking and media literacy that from history, kind of the one that is not as today defined as MIL. But so how does that look in a practice? Is we have a team of 120 people. We have partnered, one of our first partners with Wikipedia Arabic, in which we have added roughly about, as of today, 25,000 articles, and making sure that all of the articles that people are searching for on Google Trends and also through surveys, knowing what actually people in the region are searching for, and making sure that what we translate actually serves a demand. So in that way, we made sure that many of the things that when people search for anything to do with conspiracy theories to COVID misinformation, etc., we did our best to make sure that these articles are well referenced, updated, and evidence-based. And on that kind of context, and knowing all of that, we've also done a lot of physical work, and part of the logic behind it is to build that trust between the local population and us as an institution, and as a result of kind of that lack of connection between the public and institutions, that really left a vacuum for third parties or kind of non-state actors to really fill that vacuum. And that's where really militias and other kind of misinformation really took hold. So we have done a lot of physical programs, actually one of which starting next week, which is rebuilding the library that was destroyed by ISIS. So we're working actually with the library, with the University of Mosul, for us to provide and rebuild that library, especially when it comes to books. The building has been kind of rebuilt thanks to the World Bank, and I think UNESCO played a role there, but the library is empty. So we received a grant to actually be able to kind of provide the university with books. Previously, during the COVID rise in Iraq, we started a humanitarian campaign inside to provide masks and also education about the reality of COVID, and that also helped us build kind of a strong relationship, at least within the audiences, within the people that we would like to serve, and really make them more receptive to us as an organization, for them to really take our information that we share seriously. And one of the things I would say I'm very proud of, because it's kind of the most campaign that went viral in our organization, is actually the one related, which I call the vaccine against misinformation, which is the education about critical thinking and media literacy. So other than being a source, other than different sources within the ecosystem in the Middle East of constantly telling people what to think, we were focusing on telling people how to think. So we have started a full video series in addition to articles and other forms of short content, to really inform people about how to look for evidence in the article. We tried to do some funny examples about confirmation bias and logical fallacies and all of that really engaged different ages of population, whether it's from the younger age into kind of an older age, to make them be kind of immune from any form of propaganda, misinformation. And also, from a logistical standpoint, we cannot compete every conspiracy fight against every conspiracy theory, because there is a one invented every 5 seconds, and really, like, logistically, from an NGO, from a small organization, logistically we just cannot do it. But one organization that is doing that I would like to highlight, which is in the what I call the fact-checking industry, that I found really fascinating, and I really like to credit their work. Their name is Tech for Peace, and what they do is that they try to make fact-checking as emotionally resonating as conspiracy theories. So they give people the kind of the feel of pride. So one of the things that conspiracy theory is able to do is that they let you know that you're the smartest person in the room. That is really you know something that other people don't. So what they do is that they actually utilize some of these emotional techniques to make people feel as powerful being fact checkers and being for finding evidence in articles as you would in conspiracy theory mindset. So I think it's a very interesting technique we're definitely partners of this organization. And also, I believe is that the combination of this approach, which is the approach that we are following, that is kind of focused on more long-term, is that how can we create a more media literate population that is able to differentiate fact from fiction, and be able to analyze even if that information is coming from a government-run source, which is unfortunately most of the media in the Middle East is funded by the government or controlled by the government. There could be still factual information. So you cannot just dismiss something just because it's coming from, in some cases, a bad source. But if you're able to have critical thinking skills and be able to differentiate all types of information, whether that's coming from third parties or that's coming from really official state thing, I hope we will be in better situation. We have somebody from Wikimedia here, so actually I want to bring something that we're working on with Wikimedia on a sample size of 100 starting actually this year. We are training about 25 students in 4 universities in Iraq, so that's 100 students. First on kind of technical skills in which how they can become better translators, better contributors to Wikipedia, but also the other part, we're launching webinars about media literacy and critical thinking on a kind of a closed environment, which is the university context. And what we're doing is actually we're going to do measurements of pre and post to actually see how impactful some of our videos are, etc., within that sample that we're having of 100 within Iraq, to see if they're able to become better consumers of information in the future. So with that, I move it to Robert. Thank you so much.
Faisal, thank you so much. I know that now is a particularly strange time because it would be where you all would be flushed with the roar of applause coming from the audience. So please know that it's there. I'm feeling it. I'm blown away by all of the presentations. And I want to invite our audience that is out there. I know we're only able to see each other and not the audience, but to the audience that's out there to take the opportunity to put questions into the Q&A using the Q&A button that you should see on your screens. And as we wait for those questions to come in, and I'll be happy to moderate those, I want to give you all a chance, having heard each other's conversations, presentations, and really we've looked at this challenge, right, definitionally through its practice, framing it in the legal context, and then also pivoting to kind of some of these potential solutions that can be used to address it. And I'd love to give you guys the opportunity to just engage with one another based off of your presentations, to pick up on some of those synergies and continuities and maybe some of the differentiations as well that might be existing with your various takes.
I mean, I do have a question for the panelists because they're for more. I mean, there's actually a recent Pew Research that shows that more than 80% of Americans lack trust in institutions. I think in the Middle East, probably 99%. So how can institutions convince the public of what misinformation and disinformation if the public itself doesn't trust these institutions?
That's an excellent question. I don't know. So I mean, I think fact checking, right? And Faisal, I think you had an excellent point, which is that if we're talking about solutions to the problem, right? And I think this is something that I would like to hear from Costanza about as well, is that there are human and technology solutions that have to be combined, right? And Henning said the same. There are societal problems, right, that these actors are already exploiting. There are already our problems, right? So it's not just that they're taking advantage of issues that we already have, right? So one, at the human level, certainly it's that like critical thinking and media literacy will help you understand that whether the information you receive from your government institutions, right, is trustworthy, right, and truthful. So that's, I think for me, point number one. Like, how do you build that relationship of trust again, right? You be truthful and honest, and you're able to prove that, right? And people learn, right, how to evaluate that. Second, I think on the technology side, an aspect, right, of countering disinformation and thus increasing trust, right, to my mind, not the only aspect, but a big part of of enabling people to do the job of like shutting down fraudulent accounts in inauthentic information, for example, is using technology, right? Is building machine learning algorithms, right, that understand all the various very recognizable elements of inauthentic behavior on social media platforms, where it can identify those accounts or that behavior and flag them for then humans to look at and compare against, like terms of service, for example, or community moderation policies. And like that's just one aspect, right, of the whole story. And certainly there are many. But from my perspective, and I'd like to hear from Costanza too, is like I wanted to clarify that like I didn't think machines are going to solve everything, but I do think that large scale data analysis and machine learning has to be part of how we kind of counter this.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree very much. It's the combination of the two, right? Like sometimes I hear, oh, artificial intelligence going to solve everything, and then we're going to put everything in it, and they're going to sort it out, and it's done. And I really don't think so. But machine learning, it's very, very helpful to flag things for humans then to look at. And to respond to the trust in the institutions, it's not easy, right? Because it's it's like when you trust a person, it's very easy to lose trust, and it's very, very difficult to regain it. I think having worked in public information, I think what the government and institutions should do is to be much more proactive and fill data voids, especially. So when there is a situation, like an example of what not to do is what happened last year with the AstraZeneca vaccine. There was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of people didn't know what to think, and the institutions were silent, at least in Italy, for example, and in other countries. And so I think those type of things really lower trust in the institutions, right? Like if there's a void of information, that is a perfect place for disinformation campaigns to get in. And if you don't have positive public information, then that's where you lose trust.
Yeah, I also want to connect to that directly. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really done a great job of exposing all these rifts that probably already existed and all this mistrust. But now we can really see how these things unfold. I think if I look back a year ago in March, my government in Berlin in the beginning was very good at communicating the crisis, at communicating what needs to be done, what's the situation, and being very open about all the difficult decisions we have to make as a society. And I think in the beginning, you could really see that it worked. Like there was a lot of support for the government, for the measures, for the first lockdown. But then over the summer and in the fall, it really collapsed. And now it's pure chaos in the institutions. And this, you can see, I think, the results directly in society. Now we have much more mistrust when it comes to any kind of decision now that concerns the pandemic, be it like opening things again or shutting them down again. Like, and now they can do nothing right. Same with the vaccination progress. But I think this is a direct result of how this communication strategy broke down over the past year, and this is really striking. And now you can really see the divisions in society that probably were there before, but now they really broke to the surface.
And can I ask, why do you think it has changed like that? Because I also remember Germany as a very good example at the beginning. So what do you think has changed?
Yeah, it's not an easy answer to. It's a very complex situation. It has to do with the fact that it's a federal republic. We have 16 states with 16 different opinions about every measure. And also, I think, yeah, I mean, I guess in 2 years, we can look back and really analyze what went wrong. But I think after the summer, after we were so good in the beginning, when it came to really suppressing COVID-19 in this country, we kind of let go and were too careless for a couple of months, and then just to like restart this whole process of communicating that there's still a crisis, the pandemic isn't over, you probably won't have Christmas with your family, all these like difficult decisions. I think then the politicians suddenly lost the courage to keep continuing this hard messaging, these like difficult decisions that had to be made. And then I think at that point it was already too late, and now you can see the consequences.
I have a question. I mean, how can we see the questions from the audience? Because I think I'm.
Yeah, so we'll moderate them, but I am going to use the moderator's prerogative to jump in with the question. And before I do, I also want to point out that we'll be able to continue this conversation in that continue the conversation Zoom room, which will be a separate session from this one. My understanding is that all of the participants that are watching now are invited to join us over there. And we'll have to do that transition in just a few minutes. Why don't I just pivot? We'll pivot to one question from the audience. It's coming from Professor David Sloss, and it is whether the technology itself, right, is breeding the division and the mistrust. And I mean, I'll go ahead and piggyback off of that because Henning and Costanza were both talking about kind of these domestic implications, right? The use of existing domestic cleavages to kind of capitalize through that kind of foreign intervention, and then also the fact that the domestic side of the interference was going up rather than the foreign side of the interference, if I was understanding that correctly. So maybe we can take that question. We only have 3 minutes left, so if we need to pivot after that into the CTC room, we'll do that.
May I flip the question a bit on its head? Because I think in the Middle East is kind of an interesting context here when it comes to social media. Is that, I mean, social media, especially there's a lot of research done on the Arab Spring and how it was utilized. Is that in many cases in the region is that media is mostly controlled by the state, right? So you have the sources of information that are mostly false are also the mainstream media in that regard, right? And then social media, in a way, became a place for the marginalized, actually, sometimes the voice for truth. So in a way, is that, well, I think in Western society, it's probably the flip, is that because of the fact that there's editorial boards and all of that stuff, and mainstream media, in a way, balance out the misinformation, but which made the social media became kind of a source of misinformation. But I think if you flip it in more authoritarian societies, in which this authoritarians control the sources of information by the state, then actually social media became the alternative source, which is about truth and activism and all of that stuff. So I think it's probably worth bringing that comment here.
Yes, I agree. So the social media are not, evil. In fact, they give voice to a lot of voices that would not be otherwise heard. But I think it's important to say that the business model, more than the technology itself, it's what brings sows this type of disinformation, just because the business model, it's to prioritize engagement, disinformation content. It's very, very engaging. And so the algorithm is just done in that way. So until this doesn't change, yes, the technology will support more disinformation.
So if I could jump into, I think from the researcher perspective, it's very difficult to do research on social media platforms today. Many of them are not very opaque. If you look at Facebook and Facebook's properties, right, you have to sort of become a verified researcher, right, to do any of the large scale analysis of trends and things like that. And many of the places that people are moving to, Discord, WhatsApp, chat apps, I know we're at the time, are not available to researchers either. So.
Well, I'll just jump in. We only have a few seconds left. I want to thank our very esteemed expert panelists today for their contributions, and invite everybody to join us in that CTC continue the conversation link. Thank you also to my co-moderator, Jill Goldenzeal. And I hope everyone has a safe and healthy weekend. We'll see you in the CTC Zoom room. Hopefully you all have a link to that, and we'll see you there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, especially our panelists.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.